So we are into the third week of Battle Partners legality over in Japan, and as always, they are still adjusting their meta to what decks are good and what decks are bad. The current tier list looks almost completely different to what it did last week or even a couple of days ago, as players continue to tinker around, finding out what works best with what decks and what works best with other decks to counter the top tier decks. And in this video we're going to be talking about a deck that has kind of come from nowhere, but is a very clever idea and in execution actually works pretty well. And it involves cards that actually didn't come out in Battle Partners. I'm pretty sure every single card in this deck was released before Battle Partners. One of the cards actually comes from the first set of last year Temporal Forces, that card being Feraligatr. This is a 180 HP stage 2 water type Pokemon with the Torrential Heart ability and the Great Wave attack. We'll start off with the attack. For 2 water, it does 160 damage, but during your next turn this Pokemon can't use the Great Wave, so it basically can't use the same attack back-to-back turns. And then its ability Torrential Heart says that once during your turn you can put 5 damage counters on this Pokemon, and if you do, its attacks do 120 more damage. So Giant Wave will instead do 280, which is a really decent amount. However, Feraligatr will take 5 damage counters, meaning that it is now on 130 HP. This combo by itself is already pretty strong, as you can easily knock out a plethora of different Pokemon looking at the top decks. You can easily knock out Raging Bolt, you can knock out Charizard's main support Pokemon, Pidgeot EX, you can knock out Goldengo, you can even knock out some of the lower tier decks like Clefairy and Zoroark. However, that does put your Feraligatr in range of Dusknoir, which is something you may need to be aware of, but you actually don't need to be aware of that at all, because Feraligatr's main partner is the monkey himself, Munkidori. With its ability Adrena Brain, says that once during your turn, if this Pokemon has a Darkness energy attached, you can move 3 damage counters from one of your Pokemon to an opponent's Pokemon. So already that 50 damage, 5 damage counters that you put on Feraligatr is completely nullified, because you can just use 2 Munkidoris, or even then 1 Munkidori, move the damage off of it, and you still get the attack boost. So then you can actually do even more damage because you're moving 30 damage, so instead of 280 with Giant Wave, you're now doing 310, and if you have 2 Munkidoris in play, you're doing 330, which is pretty much enough to knock out almost everything in the format, 330 damage. There are some EX Pokemon that do have 340 HP, so you are going to be 10 damage short, but even then if you have a third Monkey in play, or even like a second Feraligatr, you can instead of moving just 2 damage counters, move 30 from a different Feraligatr, adding up to 60 plus 280. However, the key thing with this deck is that its pre-evolutions Totodile and Croconaw actually have pretty decent attacks themselves. Totodile's Big Bite does 10 damage, and then during your opponent's next turn, the defending Pokemon can't retreat, and Croconaw does 30 damage, but you switch this Pokemon with one of your benched Pokemon. And with the help of something like Relicanth, our Feraligatr can actually use these 2 attacks. And keep in mind that Feraligatr's ability says that attacks used by this Pokemon do 120 more damage. It doesn't specifically say that Giant Wave does 120 more damage. So if you have Relicanth in play and you use Torrential Heart, when you use the attacks of your pre-evolutions, they will do that additional 120 more damage. So instead of 10 damage and your opponent can't retreat, it's instead 130 damage and your opponent can't retreat, and instead of 30 damage and you switch this Pokemon, it's instead 150 damage and then you switch this Pokemon. Also, another thing to keep in mind is that Giant Wave says during your next turn this Pokemon can't use Giant Wave specifically. It doesn't say that it can't attack. So you could use Giant Wave to knock something out, then during your next turn you could make use of Relicanth to maybe copy something like Totodile to lock your opponent's active Pokemon into the active spot, or something like Croconaw to switch Feraligatr into something else. Switch into another Feraligatr, or maybe something even like Mimikyu. With its Safeguard ability, it says it prevents all damage done to this Pokemon by your opponent's EX and Pokemon V, meaning that you could use Torrential Heart to put 5 damage counters on Feraligatr, use 1 or 2 Munkidoris to move that 5 damage, then with the help of Relicanth, copy Croconaw's attack to do 150 damage. So if you moved all 5 damage counters off of Feraligatr, that's 200 damage, and then you switch into Mimikyu to basically stall your opponent. Or if your opponent has a specific Pokemon in the active that you don't want them to get rid of, say you don't want them to switch into your main attacker and they instead have a support Pokemon in the active, you could just constantly copy the attack of Totodile to lock your opponent's Pokemon into the active spot, while you build up Feraligatrs and Munkidoris to basically pick apart your opponent's bench while that one Pokemon is stuck in the active spot. and then once you're ready, you could bring in a Pokemon that's taken a bit of damage and knock it out with Feraligatr. Another card that this deck has also been making use of is Luxurious Cape. This card says that if it's attached to a Pokemon that doesn't have a rule box, it gets an additional 100 HP, but when it's knocked out, your opponent takes an additional prize card. So putting it on Feraligatr, it now has 280 HP, which is a lot more convenient, seeing as a lot of decks in the format can easily do well over 200 damage as like a minimum, meaning that Feraligatr can very easily be one-hit KO'd, but with Luxurious Cape, it's now basically a 2-prizer with 280 HP that has a plethora of different attacks and options and like stall and all that kind of stuff and control at its disposal. The main reason why this deck has probably only been popping up now is because of the power level of some of the other decks in the format and the fact that, you know, bench sniping Pokemon are pretty prevalent in the format at the moment with stuff like Kyurem and Regidrago, and also Radiant Greninja is a thing. Not to mention that Miraidon is pretty much just a hard counter to this deck, and currently in Japan, Miraidon is seeing literally no play at all. The deck is pretty much gone, and given that with rotation the format is a lot slower, this deck has a much easier time thriving in the format. Also, this deck can make use of the Aspec Great Tree, or Grand Tree, it's one of those ones, which basically says that you evolve a basic Pokemon into a stage 1 and then into a stage 2 by taking the Pokemon from your deck, but it can't be using the Pokemon that was put into play this turn, so on and so forth. So you can evolve a Totodile into Croconaw and then into Feraligatr, and now you have all your pre-evolutions underneath to copy the attacks with Relicanth. In terms of how the deck is doing, it is doing pretty well. It has gotten a lot of top place finishers, even winning a couple of city leagues over in Japan. The most recent one we had, it got 2nd, 3rd and 10th place, and even before that it's gotten multiple first place finishers and even then top 4 place finishers. So the deck is doing really well, despite the power level of the top decks we have in the format being Dragapult, Raging Bolt, Goldengo and Charizard. I even went up against this deck myself at locals pre-rotation, and I had a pretty tough time dealing with it, especially since I played Dragapult, so that 60 damage that I put on the bench was pretty much completely nulled because of stuff like Munkidori. And people are already playing this deck on TCG Live even pre-rotation, and they're still seeing success with it. So even though the deck has only just started seeing play over in Japan, maybe it's only just become like an idea over in Japan, the deck is doing pretty well even pre-rotation. And whoever came up with this combination of cards is kind of a genius, let's be honest, because how didn't people think of this sooner? Like, the deck literally doesn't use any cards from Battle Partners. It's just all cards that we currently have in the format. I think the newest card it plays, probably Grand Tree, which was what? Stellar Crown. That's the newest card that it plays. It doesn't play anything past that really. Some deck lists might do, I'm trying to find some, but from the looks of it, it's all just playing cards that we already have available to us in the format. Like, there was nothing released in Battle Partners that suddenly made this deck playable. It was already playable, people just didn't know about it at the time. And I imagine the deck is going to see even more play for us post-rotation as it has been doing in Japan. And that is it for this video. I can't think of anything much to say about this deck. It's a pretty simple strategy and a pretty powerful strategy at that. So I'd like to thank you all for watching this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments about Feraligatr. Will you be picking up this deck? Have you already decided to pick it up? How are you finding the deck? How do you think it will fare in our current format as well as post-rotation? Are you going to be taking it to any events? So on and so forth. I'd like to thank you all for watching. Make sure to like, comment and subscribe, all of that nonsense, and I will see you in the next video, whatever that may be. Take care.